come out. Because the system does not allow me to move a whole block of stuff, making the circle around it. So as soon as I have some time during the weekend, I will try to, implement this. Maybe I have to use another program, so, it will take me a while. If any of you can use LaTeX, that would be very welcome, so that I can send you, if I can't find it in the end, I will just do it by hand. Make a photo of that. Sometimes it's just too much. And as I said, I have this program which is called 3 Editor. Many of you probably use it. Is there anybody who wants to sit here? Because there are people places. No one. Because we have a lot of people sitting there on the side.
Lại quán rủ câu trả có khiến
多少？多少
2块钱。
20块钱。
That's what we have. Okay, it's 10:30. I think we can start. So last time we talked about the notion of parameter. This is a notion that was very fashionable in the 80s when generative linguistics and particularly formal syntax started going comparative, so not only English-based but also started considering other languages. A language group is evidently, you see what happens if you just sit in the middle, that everybody has to stand up, so you just squeeze in, it's better. So it started in the 80s when Luigi Rizzi had this idea. Notice that in Italian it's not obligatory to express the subject. Right? And then he tried to tie this to language acquisition. What is the problem of language acquisition? This is a problem that I generally tell you about during the first course, so it's typically the SICA, so the course that we start at the bachelor. So the problem of language acquisition is the following. Children are capable of learning the basics of their language in about 3 years of age. After 2,000 years of research, linguists are still not able to define a grammar as precisely as a child does in 3 years. There is this problem, it's called Plato's problem. So, it probably has to do with the fact that the child has access to some generalizations that we as linguists don't have. Evidently, the child doesn't know that he has access to, but he does, right? So when a child learns a language, he or she makes a hypothesis about the language. You don't learn a language simply by imitation, because if you learn the language simply by imitation, you wouldn't have regularization mistakes. Okay? So, and in the introductory course, I always give this example of pluralization of known words. Okay? So, and this has been reproduced in a lot of languages. You're probably going to do this in language acquisition when you have the language acquisition course. I can show you at least part of the experiment so that you know why this is important. Just a minute, I have to download the file from this is the course that you have to enroll to if you don't if you have no basics. It's unfortunately it's in Italian, but I can at least show you the examples and okay, this is it. So you give children something like the pluralization of known words. So in Italian, they use the word gobbo, which doesn't exist. It's not a word. It means nothing. Okay? And this is just to show that children don't learn by imitation. They learn by making hypotheses about the other. Okay? A very easy way to test it is in words. So the child has never heard of the word gobbo just because the word doesn't exist in Italian. Okay? And then you associate it to a little animal that looks like a cat, but it's not really a cat because it has 6 legs and a striped tail and these big eyes. So it's something that looks like a cute tiny animal. And you say, this is a gobbo. Now there are two. There are two, and the child says gobbi. The fact that the child is using the regular plural form of nouns tells you that a child does not learn by imitation. That a child learns by, extrapolating a rule out of the language he hears, and then he or she starts talking. And sometimes, evidently, children make so-called regularization mistakes, Hollandic mistakes. For instance, in Italian, it's very famous to use an irregular past participle as a regular one. Okay? So in something like English would be instead of, take for instance the fact that in English past participle are regular ones are formed with ed, right? While irregular ones are formed through change into the vowel of the root. So a child might say something like, instead of eaten, he might say eated. So regularizing the past participle. Okay? So the fact that children learn by the rule is important, because then it means that the child can learn the rules of this language in a fundamentally as a native speaker in a relatively short time. This is called Plato's problem. Why? Because Plato has this idea that there are general ideas that we have already in our mind, and we think according to this. Okay. So now, leaving aside, if you read Italian, you can download this file from not the course of syntax, but the course of istituzioni, and read it. Or yes.
By regularization of the past participle, how do children recover from the mistake?
At some point, they realize that this is actually not the right thing. I have and this is in English, I have a case that shows you that children, don't look at corrections. Okay, so the child says, nobody don't like me. This is actually dialectal English, it's not standard English, and the mother tries to say, nobody likes me. And the child says, nobody don't like me. And then the mother keeps on repeating this a number of times. And then she stood up and says, now listen carefully, nobody likes me. And the child says, oh, nobody don't likes me. So, the child insists in putting don't. And you see that corrections or even recast. Do you know what is a recast? Recast is when the child says something wrong, you're not correcting him or her directly. What you are doing is you are restating the sentence he said in another way. Okay, this is called a recast. So recast and corrections, they don't give a damn about. Okay, so it's their own language. At some point, the child sees that it's not eaten because he hears eaten a number of times. He learns that there is another class of verbs that have a change in the radical vowel, and so he starts, learning this class as well. So he starts learning also the regular exception to the rule. Okay, but it's not done through correction or recast. That's clear. That we know. Okay. So, as I was saying, children learn not by imitation. Children learn by listening, extracting the rule out of what they listen, and then reapplying the rule. Sometimes they have extracted the wrong rule, so they sort of, go up to, they had to change it. Actually, your question is a very fundamental question of language acquisition. It's about the so-called elephant in the room of language acquisition. Because people say that children, once they have a parameter, they don't change it. but this cannot be entirely correct because you see that the language of children changes. The point is that still nowadays, the school on language acquisition, for instance, the one by University of UPenn with Charles Young, and it's written this way. Charles Young. University of Pennsylvania. So if you just Google him, you will tap onto his list of papers. He is one of the most influential language acquisitionists at present, and he still has the idea that parameters exist. Although, I have been talking about this for almost 30 years. Saying, look, if you look at dialect, you see that there are no parameters. Okay, so parameter is a very fancy way to describe how language acquisition proceeds and to describe how languages work, but it's not entirely correct. Why did we say so? Because we noticed that a lot of languages in the world have the possibility to leave various lexical elements empty, so you don't pronounce them, but you interpret them. Okay, so if you say arrive tomorrow, this is ungrammatical in English because you have to say I arrive tomorrow. But if you say the corresponding form of arrive tomorrow in Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Chinese, you can do that. Okay, provided you have the right context. Okay, and so what Rizzi did in '82, and this is basically what I've been doing, is just the historical development of how things worked. For the notion of parameter in the 80s, we saw last time that Rizzi postulates that together with the pro-drop parameter, there are other phenomena that are possible. Do you remember what phenomena these were? So the first phenomenon that he said has to do with the pro-drop parameter is evident that you can leave out the subject pronoun. Okay? So you can leave out pronoun, and we saw that this is true provided you have the right environment. For the first and the second person in Italian, it's always possible. For the third person, you need to have already a referent that is established. If I come here and I say arrives tomorrow in Italian, you are going to ask me because there is no context. So you need to have the context. Okay. So the second phenomenon that is tied to this was, if you remember, that we had a list on the blackboard last week. What was this?
The post-verbal subject.
Post-verbal subject. Exactly. So the possibility of verbal subjects. This is also called pre-inversion. There is no one in the chat, right? So I could close Zoom. Well, I'll leave it another 10 minutes open and then we can close it. Because there is a student who still needs Zoom, at least she wrote to me, but anyway. So we said that the second phenomenon was post-verbal subjects. So in languages like Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, I suppose Romanian as well, you can say something like, so the corresponding form of has phoned John, ha telefonato Gianni, meaning John phoned. Or has arrived, or better, is arrived Mary, meaning Mary has arrived. Okay? So languages that have null subjects are also languages that can have post-verbal subjects. This is evidently only true for SVO languages. Okay? Because if you are in an SOV language, whether the subject is high or low in the structure, the verb is always coming at the end. So you don't see it. Okay? Okay, this was the second property. The third property, what was it? Yes.
It's impossible to have expletive subjects.
Exactly.
Like it's
the
raining
fact
and
that
you
you have expletive subjects, non-expletive subjects. And this is obligatory, meaning in these languages, you don't even have a way to translate the it of it's raining or of it seems of English, because you cannot, in Italian, you cannot use esso, questo, ciò, quello. You can take whatever type of pronoun you don't have it. Okay, it's just obligatorily no. And the last property is a complicated property. It took us, I think, half an hour to determine what it was. Do you remember what the last property is? That goes together with the first idea? Exactly. So it's possible, in all the languages, it's possible to extract an interrogative pronoun out of an invalid clause to make a main clause. So you can say, who do you think that Mary saw at the party? And this who is the object of the seeing of Mary. Okay? So it's possible to take the object out of its normal position, which in English is immediately after the past participle, and move it out to the beginning of the main clause. Okay? This phenomenon is called extraction. Okay? Or WH extraction. And actually, this phenomenon, we are going to talk about this when we do interrogative clauses. I'm just anticipating it right now, because we need it for the parameter. This type of movement is called unbounded. Or better, secret. Why? Because you can take the WH item, take out of the object of a clause, and move it 3 clauses on top. So you can say, who do you think that Mary said that Paul thought that Peter saw at the party? So this who is still the object of the seeing of Peter, but it's 3 sentences, 3 clauses on about. Okay? So provided at some point, our way of our processing capacity just breaks down, but as long as you can do that, you can even have it 3 or 4 sentences on top. Okay? That's called why that is why it's called unbounded, because you can move it as much as you want. Okay, provided you have, and it's called, the reason why it's called cyclic, I'm going to tell you when we do WH questions, because it's a complicated story. You can take, the idea is that you can take the object of a verb, turn it into a pronoun, and put it, 3 sentences on top. There are still a couple of free places here, nobody wants them, but I can do. Okay? So, we said that, given the fact that it is possible to move a WH, you can move any WH. You can move the object, you can move a prepositional, like where, when, how, or you can also move the subject. If you move the subject, what happens is that in non-proto languages, you either have to delete the complementizer, so you can say things like, who do you think went to the party? Okay? You cannot say, who do you think that went to the party? Meaning that who is the person who went to the party? So you have to delete the complementizer, so that, the element that is introducing the invalid clause, or in alternative in languages like French, which is also a null subject language, a non-null subject language, so it has this obligatory subject pronouns, you turn the regular complementizer into another element, so it's called the que to qui rule. So instead of saying que, so the usual complementizer meaning that, you use another element, which is qui, which is corresponding to who, actually. Okay? So then the last property is that you can be WH extraction of the subject. What do I mean by free WH extraction? Then you can extract the WH corresponding to the subject without modifying the clause any further, while in languages like English or French you need to modify other elements, not only the complementizer, so the element introduced in that clause. Is it clear? So, What Rizzi notices at the beginning of the 80s is that it's possible to have a notion of an abstract property that varies, and this abstract property, namely throw drop, can account for a number of different phenomena. Why does this is the fact that the child needs to learn the language in about 3 years? Why is this a good thing for language acquisition? Well, it's a good thing for language acquisition if you think about it, because once the child learns that his language or her language is a throw drop or no throw drop, depending, then he knows immediately that there are, these four properties are either all possible or all impossible. So as soon as the child, the Italian child or the Spanish child realizes that in her language you can drop the subject, in principle she could start saying, using postverbal subjects, because she knows that in a throw-drop language postverbal subjects are possible. While take an English child, the English child realizes that her language has a unitary subject pronoun, then she will not produce postverbal subjects, although it's an SVO language. Why? Because she has a set parameter of throw-drop in a negative fashion, and also she knows that there won't be any null expletive and there won't be any fixed action. So the idea was that you learn one property. It's just the same idea that you have at the supermarket when you buy 3 and you buy 2. It's the same idea here. So you just buy one. You pay 4 and you buy. You pay 1 and you buy 4. Okay. So you learn one property, but together with this abstract property, there are different phenomena that all go together. Okay. This was the notion of parameter. And as I said, still nowadays in language acquisition, a lot of people think in terms of parameter. So they say, suppose that languages differ for 30 parameters. How many possible languages do we have with all the combinations of parameters, etc.? Okay, so this notion is still used by some linguists. The point is that, as we showed last time at the blackboard, the point is that there are languages that either have this property, like they can be out the subject pronoun, but they don't have postverbal subjects. So Brazilian Portuguese is one such language. Or there are languages that can leave out the subject pronoun for some persons, but not for others. And this is the case of, I think I quoted Finnish, I quoted Hebrew, and I quoted Northern Italian dialects that have a very intensive distribution of subject pronouns. Okay? So you can have you must have a subject pronoun for the second person singular and third person singular and plural. You don't have it, you don't have an obligatory pronoun for the first singular, first plural and second plural. So it's a complicated system, okay? So which means that the notion of parameter as it stands in the old traditional work at the beginning of the 80s is not really a good way of modeling language variation and language acquisition. Okay. And language acquisition also. Is it clear? Okay. So the other point is also that together with the fact that a lot of languages can drop the subject, there are also other languages that can drop the object, the direct object, or the indirect object. Is there anybody speaking Hungarian here? It's a pity. Sometimes I do have people, because we have an Erasmus exchange with Hungary, and that's why I always ask for this. Hungarian is one such language where you can drop the object. The same happens in the Bantu languages. We talked about the Bantu languages already a bit, because in an interesting way, the Bantu languages look like the Romance languages quite a lot, although evidently there is no historical connection between the two groups. But they have similar phenomena. They are SVO language. They even have the same type of negative markers, derived from minimizers. There are a lot of similar phenomena in the two types of languages, but the Bantu languages are pro-drop for the subject, but they are also programmed for the object and for the indirect object, so for three elements. Latin was such a language. In Latin, you can omit the direct object and the indirect object also. You cannot omit anything that is introduced by a preposition, but the pure dative case can be avoided. Okay? Now, independently from the fact that the notion of parameters doesn't work as such, one might wonder where this leaving out the subject pronoun depends from. And last time we already saw a couple of things. Okay? We already saw, first of all, the first hypothesis that was made was that in a language like Italian, there is strong inflection. I suppose the same is true for Romanian, the same is true for Spanish, the same is true for Portuguese, at least European Portuguese. Okay? And you could think that the fact that you can leave out the subject depends on the fact that since Italian and the Romance languages except French have strong morphology, you can recover the notion of the information of the subject simply looking at the inflection of the verb, and that is the reason why you can drop the subject. Okay? So which means that only languages that have strong inflection are pro-drop languages. This is clearly not true. Why? Because then languages like Chinese were discovered. And Chinese is a language that has virtually no morphology at all. So the form of the verb does not inflect for first, second, third person, first person plural, second person plural. No, there is no inflection. But still in some contexts, if you have set the context right, you can drop the subject pronoun. Which means that it's not possible to tie the possibility to delete the subject to strong inflection only. Then there was a new idea, and the new idea was to say, okay, I can drop the pronoun only when a language has a consistent morphology. What do we mean by consistent morphology? Well, it either has strong morphology, in the sense of 6 distinctions out of 6 of the 6 person, first, second, third, the singular and plural, or no morphology at all. So you cover Italian and Chinese, but again, you don't cover the languages in between. You don't cover Finnish, you don't cover Hebrew, you don't cover the Northern Italian dialects, and you don't cover spoken French. Because there are varieties of spoken French where you drop some of the pronouns, but you don't drop all of them. Okay? For instance, the variety spoken in Switzerland in Gruyère, which is famous for the cheese, but in that region, they have a system which is similar to the Northern Italian dialect. It's a dialect of French, evidently, but it exists. Okay, so we are back to square one. We have two problems now. We have discovered that the notion of parameter, as it was first formulated in the 80s, is not adequate to account for at least dialectal variation, but also variation across many other languages. Take Finnish, take Hebrew, take. I think that Russian has distinctions between first and second person and third person. Also, but this is a first problem. The second problem is we don't even know why some languages allow to drop the subject while others don't. Because the story about the strong or weak inflection or no inflection at all cannot be true. Because there are languages that for some person they do one way, for the other they do another. So the pro drop is not a parameter at all. But evidently the question becomes that if the way we acquire language is not through parameters, then how do we do that? So what do we substitute parameters with? Okay? And then there was another view, namely that we learn the language as our first language simply by looking at the properties of the lexical elements that we have. In the lexicon, there has been this distinction that has been made between real contentive words like nouns and verbs and functional words like auxiliaries, pronouns, prepositions, complementizers, articles, all these things, okay? And they should be something which is separated from the real lexicon. And when we learn the properties of these elements, we also learn the syntactic properties of them, okay? So suppose that the Italian child learns strong inflection. If the child will learn that for each person of the verb, first, second, third person singular, first, second, third person plural, it is possible to omit the subject form. Okay, so it's not tied to a general process any longer, it's tied to the single lexical item. So when you learn the lexical item, what do you learn? Well, you learn its semantics. So I don't know, you learn that this is a table, and you have to learn the phonological form, so T-A-B-L-O, so then you say table. You have to learn the accent where you put it, right? Because in a lot of languages, including languages like Italian and Spanish, putting the accent in a different position makes a distinction in terms of meaning. You know, for instance, papa, papa. The first one means daddy, the second one means the Pope. Okay, and you see that the only distinction in terms of accent. So you need to learn the phonological form, the accent, the category, that something is a noun, something else is a verb. Okay, and you also need to learn the semantics. So you know the semantic of eat is introduce something into your mouth, munch it, and then put it down, or you know something like this. Or read means taking something that is written and try to interpret the symbols that you see. No? So this is the lexical semantics of the forms. But you can also learn, if you learn inflection, verbal inflection, you can also learn, for instance, that after, you know, with the verbal inflection of first person singular, which in Italian is O, you can leave out the subject pronoun. Okay? So this is the idea that essentially the properties, the syntactic properties of a language are acquired together with the lexical elements that have those properties. So when you learn that the word for cat in Italian has gender and number, and then you have to inflect the element at the end of it with gender and number, so that you can say gatto for he cat, or gatta for she cat, or gatti for a plural, or gatte for a plural in the feminine. You know, you learn it all together with the word. That's the alternative that we do. Evidently, it's not as nice and simple as the parameter. But life is not easy, we know that, so we have to make do with what we see in the language. Okay? So this is, you know, trying to solve the first problem. If language is not acquired through parameters, so how is it acquired? Answer, it is acquired through learning the properties of the lexicon, in particular of the functional lexicon. Okay? So when you learn an article in Italian, you know that it's coming before the noun. When you learn an article in Romanian, you know that it's coming after the noun. Okay? So you learn also the syntactic position of the article together with the element. So that's the idea. Okay, so that you know that in Italian articles are pre-nominal, in Romanian they are post-nominal. There are other languages that do that, for instance, the Scandinavian languages. So if you learn German, you know that the article comes in front. If you learn Norwegian, you know that the article comes after the noun. Okay? Is it clear? Now the second problem, namely, why can some languages leave out some arguments, notably the most common case is the one of the subject, but we know of cases about objects and indirect objects as well, while other languages cannot. This cannot be a morphological property. It is a syntactic property. However, you know, in the trend of work in the 90s, there was a very influential paper, and we are going to look at the paper more in detail right now. Namely, by the way, I have been told that I should not put all the articles that I put onto the Moodle. Nicola, our tutor, who is much more obedient to law than I am, told me it's not possible. So please download all the papers because we are going to take them down from Moodle. Otherwise, I would have to, teach you from game. But please do that, right? This is not a joke because I need to put them down, to take them down, to just delete them. So just download everything, even if we haven't done it already. Just download everything and then get it disappears. In the old times, what I did was I forgot the CD with all those interesting papers here in the room, and then the students made copies of it. Because I don't think you should pay for what you have already, all the parents have already paid for with their taxes, namely my salary, or the salary of my colleagues who are reading papers. So that's my stand. But actually, it's not the stand of the Italian regulation. Okay, so I was saying that in the 90s, there was this very influential paper by Janik Polak, which came out in 1989, and he presented it at a very famous conference, namely Law, and I'm particularly attached to that situation because I was one of the students handing out the folders to the participants. When you organize a conference, generally you take all your students and they are sort of, helping you with the organization. I was one of the people helping with the organization of the conference where he first said it. Why was this important? Well, it included a very interesting observation and very one of the tenets, the basic tenets of syntactic theory that have been, people have been working on in the present state, namely that morphology, strong morphology, goes together with the special syntax. Okay? This is called the mirror principle. The name comes from a book by Mark Baker. Mark Baker, which is a very famous song from the 70s, but Mark Baker. The mirror principle, what does this mean? This means that if you have strong morphology, meaning if a language has a lot of differences onto the verb or onto the noun, like for instance case, if a language has nominative, accusative, dative case, or if a language has a singular, plural, or if a language has a form for the past, one for the future, one for the modal, one for the first, second, third person, etc. This is strong morphology, so a lot of different morphology corresponds to a special type of syntax. Okay? And now we are going to do this together, looking at, it's only the slides. I'm not teaching you anything out of the slides, but maybe I can take them out. Okay, here we are. Why is it? I hate you. Why should it be this way when on my PC it's perfect? Now.
我也没得。
Okay. So, comparison between English and French. French, says Polak, is a language that has poor morphology, while French is a language that has strong morphology. As you know, the asterisk means that the sentence is impossible. Can you tell me, so let's consider the two first sentences, A and B. John kisses often Mary, which is impossible in English. I think I have a couple of native speakers of English who can confirm that you generally don't say John kisses often Mary in English. Unfortunately, I don't have any native speakers of French, which become very handy now, but but you can say Jean embrasse souvent Marie, which means John kisses often Mary. So literally, what the word for word translation. What do you do in English? Well, in English you do John often kisses Mary. This is a possibility. This is a grammatical sentence. But in French, Jean souvent embrasse Marie is out. What is the distinction?
The actors, the position of the actor.
Exactly, it's the position of the adverbs. Actually, Italian works rather like French than like English, not surprisingly. It's a Romance language. And this is the reason why a lot of Italian speakers make this mistake of saying John kisses often Mary, or saying John talks always about, or John eats always bananas, while we should say John always eats bananas. I used to teach English linguistics in Ca' Foscari in Venice, and this was one of the mistakes that my students always make, even at the higher levels, because in the Romance languages this is strongly ungrammatical. You don't say, at least in Italian, you don't say Gianni sempre mangia patate. Just bad. You need to say that in English. Okay, so the distinction between the two is in the position of the adverb. Okay? Now consider the sentences E and F. They are again the translation of each other. Okay? So you have my friends love all Mary. This is impossible, but you can have my friends all love Mary. Okay? So the element all refers to my friends. It means all my friends, but it's postponed. And in French, once again, you have mes amis and tous Marie. Tous corresponds to all, but you cannot have mes amis tous and Marie. Again, what do you see? It's the same distinction. It's a position of in this case it is a quantifier, so the element quantifying over my friends or mes amis, that is in a different position. And then, after Pollock came out with this paper, people started discovering that a lot of languages differ in the order between the adverb and verbs. And how do we model this? How do we model this variation? And you might wonder what this has to do with the previous Prodrop property. And you're going to understand what this has to do with the Prodrop property at the end of the lesson today or even tomorrow. Okay? So there is this problem hanging, namely, why should strong weak morphology have anything to do with Prodrop? We'll see in a minute. Okay? Okay. So, now, if you want to model the distinction between a language like English and a language like French, you have two possibilities, two logical possibilities. Can you just, no, everybody is just squeezing in on the side. There is no way I can have people sitting on those two spots. Yeah, okay, you have to deal with that. So, you have two logical possibilities to see, to model the distinction between English and French. What are these possibilities? Can you tell me? Yes?
That in English, the verb don't move over the adverb, while in French it moves.
Exactly. So, if you model this in these terms, okay, this is still the smallest possible structure that we have, and we said that for the moment we use this. You see that I'm always putting all the labels, or at least trying to do so. Do the same when you will be in your exam, because I don't want to see just a number of stripes and I don't know where you are. Okay, so suppose you have something like let's try to do John often kisses Mary. Okay. Well, kisses stays here, and then we have the VP Mary here, and then we said that kisses has to raise here because it has to be in a have a relation with the agent of the kissing, right? And here there is John. And then we said that John has to raise up to spec T. Why? Because it has to be in a relation with tense. It gets nominative with tense. You remember that when we talked about tenses and okay. Because if I have something like John has kissed Mary, what I see is that John is in front of the auxiliary, so we know that John has moved out. Okay? Now, what do we do with often? Do you have a position for often? Yes?
You have to create another level, voice page, for example, and you have to put in spec of voice.
Okay, you have to put another level in. We have seen voice phrase. Actually, often, what type of semantics does an element like often have? It's an aspectual thing, right? And it's called the frequentative aspect. Okay. So here we need to add another layer in between. So we need to add something like aspect. For the moment, I just write aspect phrase. And then you have the TP on top. Okay, so now we have created some more structure so that John is moving up to spec T, and then we have the adverb often here. So we have an adverb phrase that is standing in the adverb position. Okay? So now at this point you can model the distinction between English and French. Okay? So we have two problems here. The first problem is in the structure that we had up to now, there was no space for the adverb. So where does the adverb go? Well, look at the semantics of the adverb. The adverb is a frequentative aspectual adverb. So it goes into an aspectual projection, and it goes, he said, into the specified velocity. Okay? And so then we have John then is moving to its regular position, and now let's do our proof once again. John often kisses Mary. The order is right. Okay? So first you get the subject, then you get the aspectual adverb, and then you have the verb, and then you have Mary. And if you add an auxiliary, John has often kissed Mary. So has is here, and kissed. I always have black hands when I get out from lesson, and now I know why. Okay, so we know that it's that's more or less solid. Okay. Now, is it clear?
Professor,
Yes.
could you just draw from aspect again? I can't really make out where the arrows and lines are going.
I'll read it again all together so that maybe it's clearer.
Correct.
Okay. So then we have the deep in Mary here. Then we have the verb is. The verb is the most out here. And then we have John here. That moves out T. And then we have the adverb here with Oscar. And then we have has. Okay? Yes.
Do you have to place the verb in the head of aspect phrase?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Actually, the general view on minimalism is that the verb in English does not move outside of the small b. So there is actually evidence that it moves at least up to voice. We have not gone voice yet, right? Voice would be lower than aspect, okay? And then there you have also adverbs like well. And in English, if you think the adverb well goes on the right of the verb. So there is the idea that there is a short movement. The verb does not move to T. So that's clear in English, right? But it moves just a bit, not really up to here, but a bit in between. Okay? Yes.
So the header has to remain empty.
In this case, the head remains empty. Yes.
Okay, and in this case, would it be filled?
We will discover this in 5 minutes with Italian. Okay. Okay, so because this lesson runs as follows. Okay, I'm going to tell you how the schema of the lesson is. We first look at English, then we look at French, then we look at the distinction between the two inflected verbs and infinitive verbs. And then we move to Italian and to many other languages. And what I will do is I will give you 3 adverbs, and you will have to tell me in your language what the order of these adverbs is. Okay? And then we are looking at the verb position in the various languages. And once again, I'm a horrible spoiler. The solution to the point is the order of the adverbs is universal. Okay? So all adverbs in all languages are placed in the same layering, so that, towards the beginning of the clause, you get speaker-oriented adverbs like frankly, honestly, luckily, unluckily, etc. And then towards the end, you have aspectual ones. Okay? And then manner adverbs are the lowest ones. What differs among languages is the position of the verb and the position of the argument, of the object or of the subject. Okay? But the hierarchy of the adverbs is universal. This is actually something that typologists, you have a course in typology here, right? The typologists, but I think it's in the second term, right? Okay. So generally, the course in typology builds up onto this course here. Like language acquisition and dialectology. So these are the courses that, where you need this course in order to understand the contents of the other courses. In typology, typologists have already noticed that the order of the terms is universal. What is term? You remember? Tense, aspect, and mode. Very nice. Right? Okay, so as we will see, the order of adverbial elements is universal, the relative order. The way languages vary has to do with the position of the verb, that we are considering right now, and sometimes also with the position of the arguments that we are not considering yet. Okay? So that's my aim for today's lesson and the lesson for tomorrow. I think I can't make it with just 2 hours. I think it will take me a bit longer. Okay? Still have a 40 minutes time. Okay. So, this is English. How do we model French? Now, let's take again. Because these are the examples that Pollock uses. So the reason why I put them here is that he uses them. Okay. So, what do we do with French? Any ideas? Yes?
Replace the verb in the head of TP.
Exactly. We can say that in French, the verb embrasse, which corresponds to kisses, goes after T. And if it goes after T, this here, then you have Jean embrasse. Now, ask me a question. What's the problem?
Does French has auxiliaries? Or
French is auxiliaries, but we are still looking at a very simple sentence, right? I made something that looks like a mistake here, and I wanted to discuss with you. Yes?
Why aspect is still active?
Exactly. So generally for heads, we assume that the verb is moving one step at a time. I always say heads have short legs. It can just make a short step, not more than that. So essentially what we do is we first go here with embrasse. Let me just, I'm doing the French clause now, right? With the French words. I had the very nice fancy pen, and I can't find any longer what it was. So we have Marie, and then we have Embrasse. Moves. And here we have Jean, and here we have Jean. Okay. And here we have souvent. Okay? So just a minute. The distinction between English and French has to do with verb movement. Okay? So in French, embrasse moves cyclically as the verb moves up to the T position, bypassing the adverb. In English, it doesn't. So the distinction between English and French has to do simply with the height of the movement between the two positions. That was a question.
What is the justification of moving on last so high and that keeps?
Exactly. This is the next step. You remember we talked about movement, and we said movement is subject to three conditions. You always go to the upwards, you never go downwards. That's because you always go to a C commanding position higher up. You need to move to a position that is of the similar type. So if you are a head, you need to move to a head. If you are a specifier, you need to move to specifier. And the third is you need to move for a reason. Okay? So your colleague precisely says, okay, so I'm moving upwards, I'm moving from head to head, but what is the reason? And the reason was, according to Pollock, the strong morphological features of French. Because French has much more morphology than English does. Okay, it has past forms, it has compound forms, it has past participle that is different from simple past, it has a future form, etc. It's true that among the Romance languages, French is probably not the best language to take, because French is the Romance language that is losing verbal inflection more rapidly. For instance, the future form is nowadays almost exclusively done with an auxiliary, which means to go, aller. The person features are much eroded. You just have one person. But the point is that Pollock is bilingual. He's a friend of mine. I know him quite well. And he's bilingual for French and English. Because his father was English, his mother was French. And so, he noticed the distinction between the two languages he speaks as a mother tongue speaker, right? Okay, so the idea that he had was to tie verb movement to strong morphology. We go back to the mirror principle, which was here on the blackboard a couple of minutes ago. You remember what the mirror principle says? The mirror principle says if you have a strong morphology, you have a special type of syntax, and now we know which type of syntax. Movement. If you have more morphology, you move more. Okay? This idea applies throughout syntactic structure. So think, for instance, of a language that has a morphological case. In a language where you have morphological case on the noun, like Latin, you would expect that the noun moves up to a higher position. Actually, if you think about it, in Latin, there are no articles. So you might think maybe, at least at some point, the Latin noun was going up, right? To the D position. That's a possibility. You see, so Pollock has a very interesting intuition. And let's try to decompose the intuition of the paper. The paper is actually over 50 pages long. It's horrible to read. I think that in the Moodle, I have a pirate version of a handout for advanced students, and it's just download the whole book, and there is one chapter on Pollock. So the advantage of this advanced reader is that it takes the major milestones of syntactic structures over the last 40, 50 years, and it gives you the resume of it in 5 pages. Okay, and then there is a quote of the most important parts. I have had it scanned by my secretary in Germany, and I use it for my courses, but it's actually violating the copyright, so download it, and then you can cancel. You can delete it from the book. Okay? And if you go to the chapter, there is Pollock 89. You have something like 5 pages where the basic intuitions of the paper are provided. And now let's try to do this together. So what are the important intuitions of this paper? The first intuition is that you can model the distinction between English and French in terms of verb movement. Okay? So that you have 2 logical possibilities here. You either move the adverb or you move the verb, right? You either say that the adverb is moving upwards in French, so souvent moves. No. You either say that in English it's the adverb that moves, so often moves higher than kisses, and in French souvent stays put. Or the other opportunity is the one that is taken, is that you move the verb. Since there is no reason why you should move an adverb, the adverb is sitting very happily in its spectral position. It has a spectral value, and it's very happily living there. Why should it move? But the verb is an interesting construct, because a verb, take a verb in Italian. A verb in Italian has a number of elements on top. Take a verb like mangiavano, which means they ate. You see the root of the verb, so mange. Then you see a thematic vowel, a, which says this is a verb of the first class, the first conjugation. Then you see va, which is a past morpheme, and also spectral because it's continuous. And then you see no, which is the third person plural morpheme. So actually, if you look at the verb in Italian, it has 4 components, 4. It's not simply a verb. Look at the verb like, in English, it has 2 components, so far less than Italian. And sometimes just 1, because we have taken a third person, but if I had written, you have kissed, or you kissed Mary, what you have is just you. Okay, so just one. Or you kiss Mary, you would have just kiss, which is the root of the verb. Is it clear? So, the first intuition is you can model these distinctions in terms of movement. Second intuition, the verb stays put, the adverb stays put. It's the verb that moves, not the adverb, but the verb. Why does it move? Because it has a strong morphology that requires the verb to move up through the syntactic tree, up to the position where it has features. Do you remember that we talked about merge and we talked about movement, and we said that movement is always feature-driven. What does it mean? It's always feature-driven. Do you remember that we talked about the verb sending down a probe, finding a goal, and pulling it up, right? Okay, so let's look at the mechanism of movement. The mechanism of movement is a mechanism that is feature-driven in the sense that there is always a feature length. So suppose that in a language like French, T0 lacks the properties of tense, requires, it has a strong requirement for this. It sends down a probe. This time, it doesn't send out the probe for the subject, as we saw for the task. What it requires is a value for tense. And, right, so it's a value for tense. It finds the verb lower down in the sentence that has a value for tense because its morphology has a value for tense. It says present, right, in this case. So T takes up the verb and moves it up to T in French. Okay? Anyway, you see immediately that there is a problem in making such a tight link between morphology and syntax. Why? Can you tell me why? So we have seen how French works. In French, you move the verb high because T sends a probe that requires, say, present or past or whatever, future. And it needs to find an element that has that property. And that's in the verbal morphology of the verb. Since you cannot take out only one morpheme and move it up, what you do is you move the whole word, and it's the whole verb that you move up to T. So why is there a problem in such an analysis? Has anybody, do you have an idea of why this could be so? Yes?
I'm not sure, but for example, in German, sometimes you leave a part of the verb and you place the rest of it above and it's split up.
Well, the case of German is much more complicated than the English. It's a verb second language. It's called verb second because it has the verb in second position. How many people have a knowledge of German here? Just that I know. Oh, quite a few. Very nice. So we are going to talk about German and in general verb second languages after we do WH questions. When we do WH questions, we do that as well. German, it's true, that's a problem, but it's not the problem I want to talk about now. So, because it requires that I add a layer that we have not had yet, so let's leave that we will go back to that. What is the other problem? Think of English. What does English show us? So, the equation is strong morphology means movement. Does English have tense morphology? There is something on the past form, right? Yeah? So why does the verb not move in English? You see? Furthermore, English has less morphology than French does, but there is still a third person singular element. Here we have kisses, right? So there is something. So how do we explain this something? It's less than French. So once again, what does it mean to be strong from the morphological point of view or weak from the morphological point of view? Because English is weaker than French, but it's not as weak as Chinese, where there is nothing, right? And if you think of, you can take a number of languages where the morphology is more or less strong, depending on what you look at, right? So take, for instance, morphology for number and person. Italian has 6 forms, okay? German has 4 forms out of 6. Ich gehe, du gehst, er geht, wir gehen, sie gehen. So you have 2 forms that are identical. Okay? So it has 4 out of 6. French has the 3 out of 6. Je mange, tu manges, il mange, nous mangeons, vous mangez, il mange. Okay? So it has 3. And French has 2. And English has 2. And Chinese has none. So you see, how do you define strong morphology? When there is 1 distinction, when there are 2, when there are 3, when there are 4, when there are 6? You see, so this idea about a tight link, so the mirror principle that has dominated the syntactic literature of the 80s and the 90s is problematic because you cannot really say what it means to be strong morphologically. Okay? So it was very nice to say the verb moves because it has strong inflection. And having strong inflection, it reaches up at least the T position, because in French there is a past tense form that is, different from the present form, but also in English there is a past form that is different from the present. So what do we do with that? Okay. So and then now we are back to square one, exactly where we were with prodrop. What did we say for prodrop? We said, okay, we can say that languages that are prodrop are languages that have a strong inflection. What does it mean to have a strong inflection? 6 forms out of 6? None? 3? 4? You see? So once again, if you look at the tight link between the syntactic phenomena, be it prodrop or verb movement, and the morphological strength, it's not a one-to-one relation, because you cannot really define what it means to be strong morphologically. Where you cut, whether you cut at 2, the difference between 2 elements, 3 elements, 4 elements, or whatever. Is it clear? Right? So essentially, for prodrop, but also for verb movement, we are left with the fact that this is actually a decision that the syntax makes, not the morphology. Furthermore, after this paper came out, Ian Roberts looked at the history of English, trying to see how English worked in the past. And he discovered that English was a well-behaved Germanic language up to a certain point. So it had a lot of morphology. It even had case. It was SOV, so with the verb at the end. And it had, different persons. Some of you might have read Shakespeare and might have seen that the verbal forms, at least some verbal forms, have an ST for the second person, a TH for the third. There were distinctions in the past. And Roberts notices on the basis of texts, as we generally do in diachronic syntax. I'm an expert in diachronic syntax also, so that's what I work on at the moment. And what he shows is that there is a point in which English had already lost the morphological endings on the verb, but the movement of the verb was still in place. So it was working like French without the morphology of French. Which means that even from the historical point of view, the tight link between strong morphology and verb movement, or movement of any category, does not hold. Okay, it's problematic. When I started this course, I told you that this is not a course in which you learn the notions. This is a course in which you start handling problems. And you see what I'm doing? I'm trying to show you all the problematic spots in the analysis, looking at a historical perspective, also in the sense that I'm telling you about stuff that was done in the 80s and why this is problematic nowadays. You see? Okay, so now we have reached the point in which we say, okay, there is a distinction between English and French with respect to the position of the adverb. How do we model this distinction? We don't move the adverb, we move the verb. And so the verb can go up in French but not in English. And then we have discovered that Pollock tied this to the fact that French has a strong morphology, English does not. But then we notice that actually this is not so clear cut as it could be. I mean, if he had taken, I don't know, French and Chinese, it might have been better. But taking French and English also has some residual morphology, and in the history you see that morphology does not equate verb movement. Because if the two elements are exactly, one is the cause of the other, you would expect that once you lose morphology, you also lose verb movement, right? When there is a stage in the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, in which you see that the verb is still moving, although there is no morphology in English any longer. So, what I did good with this. Is it clear where we are now? Okay. So, now in the last 15 minutes, I'm trying to recap a bit and then show you what happens with non-finite verbs in the two languages, okay? So, in the paper by Pollock, he does not only look at adverbs and quantifiers like all, he also looks at negation and subject pronouns. I'm not doing this systematically here in this course because what I just need for you to understand is that the model that Pollock uses is that you don't move all these items that I listed here. What you move is the verb. And you move it because the verb has a special morphological properties in French that it doesn't have in English. Okay? It's always the same story. If you take adverbs, if you take quantifiers, if you take negation, if you take the subject pronouns, it's always the same story. Okay? Here you also get examples with negation. So in modern English, you cannot say anything like John likes not Mary. You could say that in the past, but nowadays you need to say John doesn't like Mary. So insert an auxiliary together with negation. While in French, you can very well say Jean n'aime pas Marie with the pas that is the post-verbal negative marker. Okay? Again, with subject pronouns, you cannot say something like likes he Mary, meaning does he like Mary? So you need to insert the auxiliary do. While in French, you don't need to insert the auxiliary do. You can say aime-t-il Marie? That's perfect. Okay? There is another, you probably are suspicious about this sentence. Yeah, why? No? Well, actually, this is very, very formal French. In French, generally, we say il est marié, just using the intonation. Okay? But aime-t-il Paris is just very formal French, so Macron at the Senate speaks like that. Right? It's, but people, on the street, at the market in Paris don't talk like that. It's the usual story because French is a so-called diglossic language, so the spoken language is very different from the written language. And when you are basing your grammar on the written language, bad things happen because people talk it differently. Right? But it's a problem of French actually. Okay, so the idea is that the English verb cannot climb over any of these elements. It cannot bypass adverbs. It cannot cross over quantifiers. It cannot cross over negation. It cannot cross over subject pronouns. While the French verb can do that. Okay, for all these elements. So the argument is always the same. We are reproducing always the same argument. The French verb can go higher than the English verb. Okay, why? Well, the Romance languages are systematically stronger in French than English, and this is why in the Romance languages, not just French, but also the other Romance languages, you get verb movement, while in English you don't. Okay? So what are the important intuitions? Given that generally adverbs don't move, they can be used as a map to see where the other elements are moving. Just the story that you need a lever to raise the world. You need a point. You need a point that stays put just to raise even the whole world. And here your lever are adverbs. Adverbs don't move. They are just staying put in their own position. And that's why you can count what else is moving. Because you know that they are just standing there. They stick there and there is no other. Okay? And the other story is that morphology and syntax go hand in hand. That's a mirror principle, and that is what we have put into question up to now. Okay? Because the mirror principle is actually more problematic than it seems at first sight. Now, the next step is the distinction between lexical verbs and auxiliaries. Take the verb have in English. The verb have in English is problematic because in some varieties it behaves like a regular lexical verb, while in other varieties it doesn't. Okay? So, take American English. I suppose you're American, right? I can hear it from the accent. So, your variety is probably you don't have any. He doesn't have any wool. He doesn't have enough money. That's your variety of English. You know, that's how you talk about the verb have. If you have a negative form of the verb have, you have to introduce the auxiliary do. Is that right? Just think about it. We are not used to think about our own language. That's a problem, you know.
My parents, they've been trying to learn English for a while, and they always ask me, what's the difference between don't and have, and when do I use one and the other? And they never have an answer.
Well, now you might have one. So have is used as a lexical verb in American English. So you say, I don't have money. Do you have money? So you need to insert the auxiliary do as you would do with any other verb, like, you know, have you eaten, or I don't eat anything, or did you eat, etc. Okay, so in modern American English, the verb have is just a regular verb like all the other lexical verbs, and when you need to insert an auxiliary like do in with a lexical verb, you need to do it also with the verb have. Okay, so have is not an auxiliary in these cases. When it means possess something, it's not used as an auxiliary. Okay, this is American English. It's easy because you have it. Have is just like any other regular verb. If you substitute have with possess, it will be the same. So I would say you don't possess any money. You don't own any money. Okay? Look at what I have up there. This is British English. Actually, it's not, well, I cheated here actually. Pollock cheated here. Because this is not the only variety of British English there is. Right? Are you by chance a British English speaker?
I'm an Irish English speaker. And we say you don't have. I always thought you haven't was just bad grammar or incorrect, because like you could say you haven't got any wool.
Yeah. So the problem is that generally in British English, the more conservative variant is the one that you see on the blackboard, where have is used as if it were an auxiliary. So you say something like, you haven't any wool. The examples are taken from Pollock. It's not my fault, okay? So if they are strange from the point of view of pragmatics. So you say you haven't any wool. What do you see here with respect to consider 8 with 8C? You see that here there is an auxiliary and up there is none. You know, the more modern variants of British English, they don't use don't, which is, rather typical of other varieties. I didn't know that Irish English works as American English, but they use got. You know, they say, I haven't got, or you haven't got. So they add another past participle. Okay, so they don't really use have. They use the verb get, which means obtain, right, also. So you see, probably your parents are so confused because there are all these varieties around, and the reason why you couldn't answer is that American English and what you find in the grammar of British English is different. And there are three variants. One where have as an auxiliary, so it's a regular verb. The one where, so this is a regular verb, that's the real auxiliary, and then the got version with another verb. Okay? Why am I telling you all this? Because now we are going to look at cases where there is an auxiliary and a non-finite form of the verb. And we will see that, so the other basic intuition of Pollock's paper is that auxiliaries and main verbs work differently. Okay? Why? Well, they work differently in English. Why? Well, okay, in English, you cannot say John likes not Mary. That's impossible now. It used to be okay until the 17th century, now it's not. You still find I know not in very formal style, or if you read Harry Potter, or some English novels, you find often that they write I know not, which is a sort of fixed form nowadays, but it's very very archaic. Sounds, I suppose, extremely old-fashioned. But generally, verbs, normal verbs, cannot have this type of construction. So, what do you do to repair a sentence like John likes not Mary? What do you insert? Auxiliary do. Which means that auxiliaries are something different from lexical verbs because they can do things that lexical verbs cannot do, right? So if you say John doesn't like Mary, or if you say does John like Mary, you see that do can do things, can occur in positions where the verb like cannot occur. Okay? So this is the other important intuition that Pollock had, that auxiliaries and main verbs work differently. Okay? At least in English. What about French? Well, in French, as we have seen, lexical verbs have already the properties that auxiliaries have in English. So they are treated as if they were all auxiliaries. But there is one further context in which French has a difference between auxiliaries and main verbs. And I'm going to show you this context. Okay? So is it clear up to now? So we have noticed that in English, auxiliaries work differently with respect to regular verbs because they can occur in front of the negative marker and in front of the subject in case of interrogative sentences. So you say, does he like Mary? So does is the first element of the interrogative. Okay? And we have seen that, at least for inflected verbs, French has all verbs work alike. They all work as if they were auxiliaries of English. But now, okay, let me see. Now, look at these cases here. These are cases in which you just have an infinitival verb. So in French, what is this sentence means to look, to often look sad during your honeymoon is rare. Because generally during your honeymoon you're happy. Otherwise you get a very big mistake. But once again, these are Pollock's examples. It's on my phone. So the verb paraître, which means look, seem, parere in Italian, sembrare, okay? Can bypass the adverb souvent, which we have already seen, and means often. Okay? So we know that infinitival verbs can make a step on top of often. So infinitival verbs go higher than this in French, right? In English they cannot. That's not surprising because it's we have seen that that's the way English verbs always work. So if you say something like to look often sad, this is ungrammatical. You have to say to often look sad, etc. Or often look sad during your honeymoon is rare. So the adverb has to come in front of the verb look. Okay? Now, is it clear? So it seems that for infinitival verbs, the infinitival French verb is raising higher than the aspectual adverb souvent. Now, look at another case. This is a negative sentence. Okay? It means not look sad. What happens here? It seems that the infinitival verb paraître cannot bypass the element pas, which is the negative marker. So what you have to say in French is ne pas paraître triste. So you have to leave the infinitival verb lower than the negative marker. So. It's just bad that I have to end here just in the middle of the argumentation. Let me just recap in 1 minute what we are seeing right now. So what we are seeing right now is that between inflected verbs and infinitival verbs, there is a distinction in French. The distinction is the following. Both infinitival verbs and inflected verbs must go on top of a frequentative aspectual adverb like souvent. Okay? First example. It's okay. But there is a distinction between inflected verbs and infinitival verbs in French. So we are just talking about French. Because in French, the infinitival verb cannot cross over the negative marker, but it can cross over the adverb souvent. Okay? While if you look at negation, a non-regular inflected verb can raise on top of pas. So you say Jean n'aime pas Marie. Not loves not Mary. Okay? So in French, so we stop here for today and we take it back tomorrow. There is a distinction between inflected verbs and infinitival verbs in French with respect to the position of the negative marker. And I'm going to tell you what this distinction actually is.